There's a lot of people in the 1940s that thought that it was only a matter of time until a major exchange of nuclear weapons took place between the United States and the Soviet Union. That such a nuclear war, though not inherently a world ender, would at least kill potentially hundreds of millions of people. That the devastation of World War II would just look as kind of a sideshow to the damage that would play out in places like Europe or Korea or Japan in this new nuclear age. Well, ultimately, that wasn't to be. And probably the main reason that this nuclear exchange never transpired is that very early on, by 1949, 1950, the United States and the Soviet Union start this intricate dance globally called proxy wars. A series of ideological based conflicts that pop up all over the planet where the nations kind of back opposing sides and fight each other in an indirect manner. Since your troops aren't killing our troops, therefore it doesn't necessitate a nuclear response back at you. One thing that I always think is kind of interesting about this whole Cold War era set of proxy wars, of which there are so many that we're going to get into in this unit, is that the very first of these, kind of the petri dish for the proxy war notion, where they kind of figure out the rules of the game, is also going to be the one that has lingered the most into our current age. That continues to make the headlines almost weekly here in 2017. What I'm referring to, of course, this first major Cold War struggle, is the conflict between the Koreas, the Korean War. Today on this podcast, I want to talk a little bit, not so much about the Korean War itself, though we will kind of speak circumstantially to that, but rather kind of the trajectory of the two Koreas pre and post conflict, and how kind of the path that they've been on has created a situation where you have almost two polar opposites in terms of countries, but the same base people. Now, historically, when we talk about Korea or the Korean nation as a whole, one thing that you need to understand is that Korea historically was an extremely unified country. You can go back, as far as 400 BC, and you will find a Korean state, sketched out on some ancient maps. Specifically, a common name associated with a Korean country is the nation of Chosun. And, these Korean states historically, despite being independent, were always viewed as client states of China, meaning that, China dominated them. China kind of controlled much in the way of their foreign policy, that China would allow them to remain independent, but only through the continual payment of almost a yearly tax. Well, as we had previously discussed in this course, kind of their historic trajectory abruptly changes in 1910 with annexation by Japan, and Korea becomes an integral part of the Empire of Japan from 1910 through 1945. During this time, all wealth, all resources, heck, even Korean manpower was taken for the Japanese war effort and for Japanese benefit. During the war, specifically World War II, hundreds of thousands of Korean laborers were brought to Japan to work in Japanese factories. Thousands more enlisted in the Japanese military. Millions more set to work in rice fields and mines to produce resources necessary for the fielding of large armies and navies overseas. It was a relationship of exploitation, which you could say made much of the Korean Peninsula some of the most economically undeveloped places on Earth. Now, that said, in northern Korea, the northern part of the Korean Peninsula, you did have some level of industry that existed. You had significant coal deposits, you had significant iron mines. So the Japanese did set up a number of industrial cities to manufacture and refine raw materials necessary for the continuation of this war effort. Well, from the Allied perspective in World War II, Korea was viewed as an area that would eventually be reconquered like anywhere else in the Pacific. And as early as 1943, the Allies had agreed to a plan at a meeting called the Cairo Conference, which gets its name because it did happen in Cairo, Egypt, where the groups agreed that Korea post-war would be divided along the 38th parallel. That the northern portion, the more industrial portion, the wealthier portion, in terms of the Allies, would be occupied by the neighboring Soviet Union. And that the southern portion would then be occupied by the United States. Basically, they would use the jump off of the occupation of Japan to further administer the nearby southern portion of the Korean Peninsula. And South Korea, you have to understand during this time, is pretty much an agricultural area. You have the largest city in terms of Seoul, but the vast majority of South Korea was wide open plains and rice paddies as far as the eye can see. A very poor region with not much in the way of a diversified economy or industrial development. This was something that, at least in the Korean mindset, really frustrated, I think, most ordinary Koreans. In fact, it was a common saying coming out of World War II that Koreans were like, and I quote, shrimp among whales. That they were unimportant, that the whales, in essence, being the Soviet Union, the United States, these world powers, and the shrimp, just kind of being gobbled up between the two. Well, the plan was that there'd be this occupation, and like in Austria or like in Germany, that by 1948, with the Japanese army demobilized and kind of the war wrapped up, that eventually both sides would pull out their forces, that you'd have these standalone governments, and then in 1948, you'd have these national elections. As is the case in Germany as well, this doesn't happen. Instead, what we see is that by 1949, true to that pact, that all foreign troops had withdrawn, but that we see the continued supply, specifically of the North Korean regime, of weapons, money, expertise, support from the Soviet Union. The Soviets, from 1945 onward, instill in North Korea really their hand-picked, kind of homegrown, perfectly groomed communist dictator, a man by the name of Kim Il-sung. And Kim Il-sung, was somebody who had been educated in the Soviet Union, had spent time there during World War II, was known in some kind of level of resistance circles, as being a decent leader. But he definitely was not the most decorated of the Korean resistance fighters from World War II. Well, when the Soviets bring him in as kind of their puppet government and they place him in power in 1946, they also bring with him the NKVD. And the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, then goes about eliminating any and all other people in North Korea that had any kind of political clout whatsoever. So we're talking about people that had been viewed as, national heroes in the fight against Japan from 1910 to 1945, that then get rewarded for that by being eliminated in 1946 by Kim Il-sung and his underlings. Kim Il-sung then sets up an extensive network of gulags, these forced labor camps, pretty much modeled after what Stalin had done in the Soviet Union. I always say that, when you look at North Korea today, it seems like such an anachronism to people. It seems so out of place in the modern world because it pretty much operates the same way the Soviet Union operated in 1930. That it pretty much operates the same way that China operated in 1953. That Kim Il-sung, this dictator of North Korea all the way until 1994, an extremely long tenure in office, basically used Mao and Stalin as these ideal models that he hoped to replicate. Which makes it different is that, China has kind of opened up and reformed and now has close ties with the West. Of course, the Soviet Union has collapsed and is no more, and even past Stalin's reign, the Soviet government acted completely differently. North Korea has pretty much continued on that kind of same trajectory. Gulags, cult of personality, mass censorship, purges and elimination of anybody that's viewed as disloyal or showing any kind of dissident whatsoever. These were hallmarks of the kind of things that were very characteristic of communist government in both the Soviet Union and China, really around this time period. Now, Kim Il-sung is somebody that pretty much from day one kind of goes off script then, though. He adheres to some things that Stalin had done and how he had been trained, but he also kind of ad-libs and he does his own thing. Specifically, one way that he was very different and much more extreme than Stalin was from day one he institutes an economic policy called Juche. Juche referring to total self-reliance from the outside world. This notion, this idea that the Korean peoples didn't need assistance from anybody else. That we have everything that we need within our own national borders, that we should be proud of Korean culture, that we should be proud of who we are. Well, we know in today's day and age that extreme isolationism generally is not overly good for a nation's economy long term. Short term, okay, it might work. You might get some, surge in economic production and industry because everything you need to be building within your state. But long term, you're going to see stagnation. You're not going to see this influx of outside ideas and technologies. You're not going to have access to things cheaper that are made abroad. Well, at first, when Kim Il-sung institutes this Juche, this is something that actually really has a lot of appeal to many Koreans north and south. I remember reading one book on the subject that pretty much said that, if you look at this communist Juche model, that it's pretty much an ideology that couples communism with extreme nationalism. That Korean people should be proud to be Korean, that we should stand alone, that we shouldn't need to rely on anybody else. Well, for a Korean peoples who had known nothing but direct domination for the previous 35 years by Japan, and that prior to that had pretty much known domination from China for hundreds of years, this really sounded like a legitimate answer. One of the best books I've ever read on the subject of North Korea, period, and I totally recommend to people, is a book entitled The Aquariums of Pyongyang. And the story, starts off with, it kind of tells the story of this family's history, where you had this family of Koreans who had moved to Japan during, the imperial period. The grandfather then had ended up opening up like a small casino. I forget what town, maybe Kyoto or some other large Japanese city, and ends up making a decent amount of money. He ends up being extremely prosperous, a lot of wealth, family in a really good economic situation. And then World War II ends. And the Koreas are divvied up, and people like him are offered the chance to return back to their homeland. Well, the choice that many Koreans abroad then faced was, well, which Korea do we return to? Do we return to South Korea, this poor, kind of backwards agrarian state, which frankly was run by a dictator of their own, U.S.-backed dictator, but pretty much a dictator? Or do we go north, where there's industry and jobs, and you have this regime that says, well, no, we're not going to be puppets of a foreign country, that we're not going to be puppets of the Soviet Union, that we're not going to be puppets of the United States, that we are going to stand on our own and be about ourselves. Well, in that story, the Aquariums of Pyongyang, the family ends up moving back to North Korea. The parents, so the kids of the grandfather who had made the money, become members of the Communist Party, and they assume that, hey, we're going to move back and we're going to have this comfy life, and that everything's going to be, utopian. This is going to be great. Well, almost immediately after moving there, they have all of their wealth seized. They had an automobile, it was seized and reallocated to a higher up within the communist government. Their money, much of their material possessions taken. And it's not long after that all of a sudden they're put under surveillance, and then they're deemed as capitalist sympathizers. That the grandfather had engaged in capitalism and greed, and therefore he was a class enemy. And his family members, by association, were class enemies. And that to get rid of that kind of black mark on their family name, they needed to be sent to one of these labor camps. They had to work it off. And so the family is arrested. They're sent off to a gulag. And the author then of the story spends the next 10 years pretty much going out into the mountainsides and harvesting timber and bringing it back by hand in these work gangs, and never sees his grandfather again. Well, once again, why I tell this story is that, it just speaks to the total isolation and control that exists in North Korea pretty much from the very beginning. So when you look at, documentaries or things about today, and you ask yourself, like, how did these people get to this point where they think that they are truly living in, some utopian paradise? It's because their ignorance of the outside world is now multi-generational. The people that are now adults never lived with a true, accurate view of what things look like beyond their own national boundaries. They've known nothing but complete and total censorship in isolation that starts in 1946. Now, getting back to kind of the development of the Koreas. So you have this basically situation in place by the late 1940s. And then as a shock to everyone, and I mean everyone, including Joseph Stalin himself, on June 25th, 1950, North Korea invades South Korea. I think from the perspective of Kim Il-sung, I think he figured that, okay, the rest of the world wouldn't care. The rest of the world wouldn't care if, he rolled on through and took over this kind of backwards agricultural, place that really didn't have much in the way of strategic or economic value. But he bet it wrong on that. In one part of this that he probably should have kind of thought through a little bit more before he launched this surprise attack is that our nation then brings the issue before the United Nations and says to the United Nations, we need to send in a policing force, a UN force, to drive out this invading army. Well, this proposal would have usually been then vetoed by the Soviet Union when put up for a vote. Soviet Union had a veto power where they could strike down all kind of measures or resolutions. Even today, Russia still has veto power within the UN Security Council. However, the Soviet Union on June 25th was boycotting the UN. And they were boycotting the UN over Taiwan's inclusion and not the formal recognition of the communist Chinese government, something that was also a fairly recent development. So supposedly when Stalin hears about this and he hears about, the fact that he wasn't consulted by, this guy that he had put into power and had helped, eliminate all opposition to, supposedly Stalin just loses his mind. Because you can bet your butt, if Stalin would have known about it, he would have had his ambassador at the United Nations ready to veto this at a moment's notice. Well, of course, we know then the story of the Korean War. The war goes back and forth for 3 years, completely decimates the country. The Chinese end up getting involved at one point because General MacArthur goes way too close to the Chinese border. And so next thing you know, there's 300,000 Chinese troops pouring in. By the end of the war, though, nothing changes. The regimes are still in place, U.S.-backed dictatorship in the south, communist dictatorship under Kim Il-sung in the north, 4 million deaths, country in ruins, 2 countries in ruins, as well as 36,000 American lives lost. At the end of that conflict in 1953, no formal peace treaty, though, was ever signed. Instead, simply a ceasefire was signed. They constructed the demilitarized zone. You pull back your forces from the demilitarized zone. But none of the specifics and technicalities and everything else that go into a formal end to a conflict were ever solved. And this is something that we see today, continues to cause problems, especially with things like the maritime border between the Koreas. There's a whole bunch of islands off the coast where it was never fully established who owns what. Hey, there were South Korean troops on that island in 1953, therefore it's South Korean. Well, the North Koreans don't agree to that. So we still see flare-ups sometimes occur with some level of loss of life and the potential for things to blow up into a bigger conflict because of that lack of a peace agreement in 1953. Now, moving forward, I mentioned that North Korea will continue to be ruled the same way throughout Kim Il-sung's life. In 1994, then, he'll eventually die of a heart attack. And power will then pass to his son, the second generation of Kim leaders, Kim Jong-il. And Kim Jong-il will rule the country from 1994 until 2011. During Kim Jong-il's reign at the helm of the North Korean state, the country was basically characterized by really bad economic mismanagement, combined with natural disasters, specifically floods. But most importantly, the effects felt from the collapse of their main benefactor, the Soviet Union. Because of this combination of factors, you get massive food shortages, massive energy shortages. Both of those things are always things that North Korea has had a hard time providing for its own people. And to give you, just an idea of how bad things got as quickly as they got. So the GDP per capita in 1991 in North Korea, 3 years before Kim Jong-il takes power, same year that the Soviet Union collapses, late part of that year, GDP per capita, $2,460 per person. By 1995, that number drops to $719. Exports. Now, once again, this is supposed to be a self-sufficient state, but even a self-sufficient state needed to trade to some extent with other nations. Exports 1991, $2 billion worth of exports, mostly to China and to the Soviet Union. 1995, that number drops to 800 million. It's over halved in 4 years. And so at the same time that everything seems to be falling apart within North Korea, Kim Jong-il launches a massive program of military spending. This part of it always kind of boggles my mind too. And if you wonder, well, why would you up spending during a famine and with all these problems? I think at the end of the day, the Kim regime had always felt that as long as the Soviet Union was around, that they had an ally that had their back. But I think that by the mid-90s, with the Soviet Union no longer around and with a Chinese government that was opening up to the West, I think that they really felt like their back was up against the wall. So it's Kim Jong-il that is going to ultimately be responsible for starting North Korea's nuclear weapons program, a program that is successful within a number of years in developing nuclear warheads, and since has continued to build missile systems capable of delivering those nuclear warheads farther and farther abroad. But this, once again, came at a massive cost. It was a huge part of the government's money that could have been used to feed its people at a dire time that was spent on warheads and weapons and uranium. And then in addition, this brought about greater international sanctions and economic penalties to the point where today the only real trade that North Korea has is some level of small trade with China and some small level of tourist visits from other nations. That's pretty much it. We're talking a minimal global economic footprint in a very poor and backwards country. Well, the last kind of development in terms of the North Korean state is that in late 2010, Kim Jong-il then abruptly dies. And the official cause of death that was announced by the media of North Korea was that he overworked himself to death. So who knows? Supposedly, Kim Jong-il was somebody that loved to drink the most expensive brandies and to eat really expensive foods and everything else. So I'm sure that probably had a greater part of his cause of death than anything else. But when he dies in late 2010, power then passes to the third generation of Kim leaders, a leader by the name of Kim Jong-un. And what's so weird about this kind of last generation is that up until the point that he takes power, many outside observers weren't even aware that he existed. And things like age of this new Kim leader was highly speculative. Most things that I've read cite that he was probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 28 or 29 years old, making him one of the youngest heads of state on earth when he takes power in 2010. But once again, to this day, that kind of remains unconfirmed. What we do know about Kim Jong-un since his ascension to leadership is that he spent those years where he was kind of off the grid actually being educated secretly in Switzerland at a live-in boarding school. And that for some of the time when he first took power, there was a lot of question marks about, how much power did he really wield within the North Korean government, though like his father and like his grandfather before him, we've seen through headlines and news stories that he is kind of gradually clamped down on potential dissident himself. Most notable being a few years ago, he ordered the arrest of his uncle, who was one of the highest ranking members of the Communist Party and a main advisor to him. And he arrested him on treason charges, basically had him executed. And there's been other similar major purges of the Communist Party since. So, I always say that probably the best way to characterize the North Korean government today, other than just being completely isolationist and, exercising censorship to the most extreme degree, is that it's very much a communist hereditary monarchy that's backed up and supported by kind of military rule through membership of a single political party. So yeah, that's a mouthful, but I think that's probably the most accurate way to describe where they currently are. Now, in terms of South Korea, just to kind of give them a shout out as well. So as I kind of alluded to, so from 45 through 61, that country is dominated by a dictator by the name of Syngman Rhee. And Rhee declares martial law very early on. He uses that as a way to justify imprisonment of opponents and restricting people's basic freedoms. So, the thing I oftentimes say about the two Koreas is that if you look at things like, their overall economy, and you look at things like income levels, and you look at overall economic production in the nation, and you look at level of freedoms exercised by their peoples, really North and South Korea weren't overly different during much of the 40s and much of the 50s. It's only during the 1960s, though, that we start to see that kind of change. First of all, the military takes power in 1961. From 1961 through 1979, the military rules either directly or indirectly through kind of puppet governments. Still kind of an unfree society, but they gradually start loosening up the strings there. They start to encourage outside investment. Lots of Japanese companies come in and open up shop. And by 1980, the government starts to allow some level of elections, with the first uninterfered national election held in 1987. So South Korea, as a prosperous, Western-oriented, market capitalist state, is kind of a very young, new thing. And today, if you go to South Korea, you'll find it's a very urban country. Bulk of the population lives in Seoul or other cities. GDP per capita very high, in the mid to upper 30,000s, and it's considered to be one of the most high-tech places on earth. So that difference of trajectory is only something that we've seen for about the past 40 years. Yet today, the Korean Peninsula couldn't be any more different. It's an absolute contrast. I remember one time reading an essay on the subject of North Korea, and the author made note that basically crossing over the DMZ is like traveling back in time, that you enter into a world that's inherently disconnected, where things like running water and electricity in some of these isolated villages are not the norm, where labor camps like gulags still exist and include hundreds of thousands of people. And then you get to that northern border with China, and all of a sudden you're back in modernity again. The million-dollar foreign policy question, I think, on the minds of many people is, how much longer can this last? Here you have a setup that reflects the early Cold War, this earliest proxy battleground. And yet, here in 2017, the rest of the world has fundamentally changed. With the rapid spread of globalization, the connections with the internet, the fact that people can now tune into satellite television, will we see this Kim dynasty last for another few generations? The answer to that is, of course, anyone's guess.